Ever feel like, sometimes there are these hidden costs in life, like things you can't really put an actual price tag on?
Yeah.
That's what we're diving into today, this idea of an autism tax.
And you're right. It's about way more than just money, right?
Exactly. Your stack of articles from Cheap ABA really, really brought that home for me.
Absolutely. It's about really grasping like the full weight of what autism can mean. And not just for individuals, but for, their families too.
Yeah, yeah. It's like on the surface, you might not see these extra challenges people face.
Exactly. It's like they're carrying this invisible backpack, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's filled with, say, rocks. Each rock, represents another challenge, another burden, a burden that most people don't see.
And when you mentioned cheap ABA, that's a perfect example. Families facing this impossible choice between like potentially less effective but affordable therapies or the gold standard that could wipe out their savings.
That's a heavy rock for anyone to carry, for
Yeah.
sure.
It really drives home that whole cost of living aspect, but in this case, it's about living in a world that wasn't built with everyone's differences in mind?
Precisely. And we're not talking about minor inconveniences here. This tax has a ripple effect. It impacts mental health, relationships, job opportunities.
Yeah.
It's woven into every single part of life.
One thing that really struck me in these articles was the topic of social isolation. And it's not about people with autism being antisocial, right?
Right.
But the articles shared these stories about how everyday social interactions, they can be really, really tough and often lead to, intense feelings of loneliness.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember this isn't a choice, right? Imagine constantly misinterpreting social cues or feeling just completely overwhelmed by the nuances of a conversation. It's like it creates these invisible barriers to connection, barriers that many people don't even realize exist.
One article I remember told the story about this woman who dreaded office birthday
Oh,
parties.
wow.
And it wasn't that she disliked her colleagues, not at all. It was the forced small talk and the loud singing. It was sensory overload disguised as a celebration.
Wow.
And that really stuck with me.
It's a perfect illustration of how something so commonplace, so expected, can be incredibly taxing for someone with autism. And, it's not just about being uncomfortable. It's about, like, fundamentally experiencing the world in a different way.
And speaking of experiencing the world differently, that's where sensory overload plays a huge role, right? Like bright lights, loud noises, things that most people can tune out can be incredibly distracting or even painful for someone with autism. That's according to these articles, of course.
Absolutely. And this is where that invisible backpack analogy really becomes especially relevant, I think. What might be perceived as someone being picky, like, say, they only wear certain clothes or refuse to eat certain foods, could actually be their way of managing a world that feels like it's constantly dialed up to 11.
It's like their sensory input is stuck on high and they're just trying to turn down the volume a little bit.
Exactly. Now imagine trying to navigate a job interview or a first date in that state. The autism tax isn't just about daily hassles. It impacts those big life moments too.
And of course, we can't ignore the financial burden. Therapy is a big one. And like you said, finding affordable options is a whole other deep dive we could do.
Oh, absolutely. But it goes beyond just therapy too. Think about the job challenges we just discussed, right? Underemployment or frequent job changes due to sensory overload or social difficulties. All of that takes a toll financially.
For sure.
Not to mention the cost of specialized education or, modifications to make a home more sensory friendly. It adds up.
And often it's not covered by insurance.
Right.
So you've got families struggling to afford basic needs on top of everything else. And the articles also talk about how this often forces parents into becoming like unpaid advocates.
That's such a critical point. Parents of children with autism often become experts in navigating these complex systems, education, healthcare, social services, all to try and get their child's needs met.
It's like having a second unpaid job on top of everything else.
Yeah.
No wonder the articles mention mental health so often. Anxiety, depression, ADHD, all more common in autistic individuals, they said.
It makes sense when you think about it. Imagine trying to manage your own mental health, right? But you're also navigating a world that wasn't designed for your neurotype. It's a lot to carry, even without the added weight of stigma and misunderstanding that still, unfortunately, surrounds autism. And that's where something called masking comes in. The Cheap ABA articles touched on that a bit.
Okay, so we're not talking about like literally wearing a mask here, are we?
Right. Masking in this context, when we're talking about autism, it's about how some autistic individuals, they learn to adapt their behavior, to kind of fit in, meet those social expectations.
Interesting.
So they might suppress certain behaviors, try to mimic social cues, try to appear more neurotypical.
So almost like they're putting on an act in a way, but it's not like a manipulative thing, right?
Mhm.
It's more about just trying to get through the day without drawing unwanted attention to themselves.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
got to be exhausting.
It can be incredibly draining. And the articles mention high masking, which takes it to like a whole other level.
Hi, masking.
Yeah, these individuals have become so good at masking that even like close friends and family might not realize they're autistic.
Wow. See, I hadn't even thought about how that might like impact getting a diagnosis or even just finding the right support.
Oh, absolutely. High masking often leads to a delayed diagnosis, which of course makes it harder for individuals to access the resources they need. And it can create this really deep sense of isolation, this feeling of not being known, even by the people closest to them.
It's like they're carrying that invisible backpack, trying to manage all those extra challenges, but then they're also trying to camouflage it at the same time. It
Yeah.
makes that whole autism tax idea even heavier.
Precisely. And because that diagnosis is often delayed, it adds another layer to the tax, that emotional weight of not understanding why you experience the world differently, why things feel harder for you.
You mean like going through life feeling like something's wrong with you, but not having the words to explain it, let alone get help?
Exactly.
Mm.
And without that understanding, it's easy to internalize those feelings of difference as like personal failings.
Which can then spiral into anxiety, depression, all those other mental health challenges we talked about. It's like a chain reaction.
It is. It
Yeah.
really highlights the importance of early diagnosis and providing support.
Yeah.
You know, when individuals understand their neurotype, they're better equipped to advocate for their needs and access resources that can really help them thrive.
So it's not just about recognizing autism in others then, but also creating a space where people can question their own experiences without judgment to seek out information and find support.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is understanding that autism exists on a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
How it looks in one person can be totally different from how it looks in another. There's no single autism experience.
Right, it's not like checking boxes off a list.
Exactly. And that's why all those old labels like high functioning and low functioning, they're so outdated. And honestly, they're harmful. They oversimplify what it means to be autistic and diminish the unique strengths and challenges of each individual.
And it reinforces this idea that there's a right way to be autistic, which just isn't true.
Right. Each person with autism has their own way of experiencing and interacting with the world. And embracing that diversity, that neurodiversity, it ultimately makes our society richer.
Speaking of different ways of experiencing the world, I was really struck by how many everyday tasks can become major hurdles for people with autism. Just based on what I was reading in these articles, simple things.
Oh, absolutely. Take going to the grocery store, for example.
Yeah.
The fluorescent lights, the background music, the crowds. For someone with sensory sensitivities, it can be completely overwhelming.
Oh, yeah. And then try to navigate a busy airport or a crowded concert.
Right.
No wonder some people with autism might avoid certain places, certain events.
And it's important to remember, this isn't about being antisocial or difficult, right?
Right.
It's that the environment itself is creating a barrier for them.
Which is why that awareness and understanding is so important. Like these articles mention things like sensory-friendly hours at stores or providing noise-canceling headphones at events. Small changes that can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that inclusivity isn't just about, inviting everyone to the party. It's about making sure the environment itself is accessible and welcoming. And this applies to the workplace, too, which the Cheap ABA articles also delved into.
Yeah, they talked about those unique challenges that autistic individuals often face in traditional work settings. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Of course. Imagine trying to navigate the unspoken rules of office politics or dealing with sudden changes in routine, all while managing this sensory input that's constantly bombarding you. It can make it extremely challenging to not only succeed, but to simply get through the workday.
Not to mention the pressure of masking, maybe worrying about having a meltdown all while trying to focus on your actual job.
Exactly. And unfortunately, not all employers are aware of or willing to accommodate the needs of neurodivergent individuals, which of course leads to discrimination and bias.
One article profiled this programmer, and he was clearly brilliant at his job, but he struggled in team meetings. And it turned out the fluorescent lights in the conference room gave him migraines. He ended up being let go. And it wasn't because of his work quality, but because of how his discomfort was perceived by others.
That's heartbreaking and unfortunately not uncommon. It really underscores the importance of advocating for workplace inclusivity and supporting organizations that champion neurodiversity.
Right.
There's so much untapped talent and potential within the autistic community,
Yeah.
and we all lose out when those talents aren't recognized and nurtured.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to not just work, but to truly thrive and reach their full potential. It
Mhm.
really makes you realize, diversity, it isn't just about what you can see, right? It's about how we think, how we process information, how we each experience the world.
Yeah, and when we embrace those differences, those neuro differences, we all benefit.
Because a world that's designed for everyone is just, it's just better design, period.
Couldn't agree more, yeah. And that brings us back to like the heart of this whole autism tax idea. When we understand those hidden burdens, the unseen costs that autistic individuals and their families navigate every day, then we could start to break down those barriers. We could start to build a more inclusive, more equitable world.
It's about understanding that support. It isn't about giving someone a leg up. It's about creating a level playing field. It's about giving everyone that opportunity to reach their potential, no matter how their brain is wired.
Exactly. And there's so much potential to unlock. These cheap ABA articles, they highlighted how autistic individuals often have these unique strengths, right?
Yeah.
Like attention to detail, pattern recognition, a strong sense of justice.
It's like their brains are tuned to like different kinds of brilliance. So how do we shift our thinking as a society to create spaces where those strengths are, valued and nurtured rather than dismissed or misunderstood?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It starts with awareness, like
Oh.
like we've been talking about, but it also needs action,
Yep.
right? Supporting organizations that champion neurodiversity, pushing for more inclusive education and employment practices, even just making effort to listen and learn from autistic individuals themselves.
Because knowledge without action is kind of like a book on a shelf. Interesting, maybe, but ultimately passive. What are some ways that listeners can maybe take this knowledge from our cheap ABA deep dive and put it into action?
What could be something as simple as, choosing to challenge your own assumptions when you encounter someone who might be, struggling with social cues or sensory overload. It's about offering understanding instead of judgment and remembering that everyone experiences the world in their own way.
And seeking out autistic voices too.
Right.
Reading books and articles by autistic authors, listening to podcasts, watching documentaries. It's about getting those perspectives directly from the source.
Exactly. Because that lived experience, it's invaluable. And if this conversation has, resonated with you at all, if it sparked your curiosity, don't let that feeling fade. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a world that's more inclusive and understanding of all neurotypes.
Because a world that works for autistic individuals is a world that works better for everyone. And that's it for today's deep dive. We'll be back next week with another look at a topic impacting the autism community.